Professor Brands, thank you so much for being with us here today.
No problem. Glad
Yeah.
to be here.
Well, I want to start with, back in 2018, you won an award for Best Teacher in the Netherlands. In 2019, here at the TU, you won also another award. I want to understand, where does that passion come from? Where does that drive come from? As a kid, was it an event, a story, a person who really inspired you to pursue aerospace?
Wow, that's a quite a complicated question to sort of answer, because if I actually look back, where I ended up was a series of chances and sort of deeks left and right and changing focus and that, because I started university thinking I never want to do a master's.
Yeah.
And never want to be an academic. I started, it actually started with I wanted to be an astronaut. As a kid, I grew up in the age of the space shuttle, and that was, it was a golden age for space travel. And I remember having the luck of being able to see the space shuttle re-enter over Canada. They were doing a weird orbit one time, and I actually got to get up in the wee hours of the morning, and it was dark outside, and I got to see this plasma ball glowing over the shuttle as it came zipping over at just an ungodly speed. And that inspired me so much to see like these cool rockets and this thought that we're going to build moon bases and all these sorts of things. So that really got me interested in designing things. And I started actually studying at University of Calgary. It's where my family was living at the time, because in Canada, it's a slightly different education system. That engineering, you don't pick your specialization first year. So first year engineering is common for everyone. And I was going to study mechanical engineering as my path to aerospace. But I quickly learned that in Calgary, everything around mechanical was focused around oil and gas, naturally, because of the area. And then I looked up, where could I transfer to? And then I transferred to Carleton University, where I finished my bachelor's, and I actually went there to really do space. And then in my first year with the aerospace focus, before I had to specialize, I realized that 95% of space stuff at the time was design this box that orbits like it's a boring satellite. I didn't, for someone who wanted to make like rockets and lunar bases and interesting things like that, the space industry at the time and what I was learning was very uninspiring. So I pivoted to aircraft.
Yeah.
And then 9/11 happened right when I graduated, and so then it was very difficult to get a job. So I was like, okay, I can't get a job in aerospace, because most Canadians went to the US, but suddenly you had to be an American-born citizen. And so I ended up doing a master's. Luckily enough, I was doing master's on glare, which was a material invented here in Delft, and that was my initial exposure to things in the Netherlands. And so at the end of my master's, the aerospace industry hadn't recovered in Canada, so I decided to do a PhD. And then came here on an exchange, and then went afterwards, came and did a postdoc here. So it was just sort of like, just kind of continuing, like this opportunity is here. I can either do that or who knows.
Yeah.
And I think life is like that. So I ended up being here to be a peer researcher.
Right.
And they needed someone who could teach the English cohort for the first year in the faculty when I was doing my postdoc, because at the time, half of the first year was in Dutch, half was in English.
Okay.
And I started playing around with teaching there, and I really it just clicked with me. Like being able to convey knowledge and see light bulbs go off in students' heads, and to see students mature as well. Like I teach a lot with first year students, and I acknowledge they come in, they're kids still, right? 17, 18-year-old. Yes, you're not a teenager or kind of kid, but you're still quite young and immature. You probably have never cooked for yourself or done your own laundry. Like there's quite a lot of growing in life in that first year. And it was interesting and cool to see people struggling with life, but also what they wanted to do with their career.
Yeah.
And I just applied myself to it.
It's amazing. You did a good job of summarizing the last few years. So talk to me a bit more about getting that master's, doing that PhD. What was that process like? What were the challenges you faced?
Well, the system of doing a master's and PhD in Canada is quite a bit different from here. So a master's, there used to not be a separate bachelor and master's in the Netherlands, right? So there's still this historical thing of a 5-year program and you get a master's degree. Whereas in Canada, most people end at the bachelor. That's the natural end point, that ending of studying, and then you get an engineering career. And so only, 10 to 15% of students will pursue a master's. So that makes it almost closer to a PhD. There's this filtering, like it's really, you're kind of putting off making money and putting yourself through more school where you're paying tuition. So there is a down selection so it feels a little bit more like a PhD in terms of the people that you're around.
More research focused.
More research focused. You're considering to have done your specialization in your bachelor already. So I did an aerospace structures and materials specialization in my bachelor's.
In the bachelor, okay.
And then my master's was all electives. Like there was no track or it was just, take some courses that you think will enrich your knowledge. And you started with your research pairing with a supervisor from day one. And so you would start with doing a literature study in line with your courses, and then hopefully your coursework would help you with your literature study. And as a result, because of that sort of selection that not everyone goes through, it also opens up different things for scholarships and funding to also help motivate, ideally is maybe the wrong word, but the government wants to try encourage the right people to do a master's. So you can apply for a personal grant based upon your own research ideas, your leadership potential. And that's what I did. So I basically applied for a government grant, got money, and then I could study anywhere in Canada because I had the money to pay tuition, money for research. I didn't have to find a professor that had money to support my master's degree. So that was an interesting sort of difference. And then on the PhD level, different from here in the Netherlands, as a PhD, you're not a student because you are not paying tuition. You are paid a salary. You actually have healthcare and pension. You're really an employee. You're hired by the university as a researcher. Where in Canada, it was the other way around. You're still a student. You still pay tuition. Yes, there's funding. But you're eating a lot of ramen and still living the student life to try and get through. I think that there's a lot of opportunities with the PhD system here. It gives a lot of people a chance to succeed and develop themselves. But it's also easy to be comfortable. Like when I was in my PhD, it was like, I have to be done in 4 years, full stop.
Okay.
I can't.
What gave you that incentive?
Essentially, you would see a lot of your friends having jobs and making money and living their life, and you're still a student, and you're like, then you're kind of constantly faced with, is this really what I want to do? And it's kind of weird how adversity does that to you, right? It kind of makes you reflect on the situation you're in. This is hard. Is it worth it?
Right.
And if it is, you persevere and you go on and you try and get through it. Sometimes when you don't have that adversity, you just coast.
Sure.
Which applies to all sorts of things in life. And, even students studying in university, of how many people really struggle in their first year and maybe drop out of aerospace and go study somewhere else.
Right.
Adversity makes them face that.
Of course, it makes you grow as well, I think.
Yeah.
And is there a piece of advice you would give yourself, looking back now? You mentioned how tumultuous the period was, especially with 9/11. And is there anything you would, tell yourself, look, you're doing your master's, you're looking to do a PhD, maybe look at this option, maybe do this a bit differently?
The thing that I wish I knew earlier, I learned this the hard way, was you need to set your own expectations. You can't live towards other people's expectations. And make sure that, because you're destined to fail to meet someone else's expectations.
Yeah.
There's always someone out there that you're going to disappoint. And, I did that while studying my bachelor's. I thought, I need to get good grades because that's what people expect. That's what employers expect. And that's what will make me successful. And I never kind of really looked at, do the grades matter to me? And I know that seems a little bit weird, but there is a fine line between looking at a course and mastering it and getting the highest grade.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
That's true.
you can master something and not necessarily get the highest grade. And I've seen that actually with a lot of students where the students with the top grades actually fail to master some skills.
Yeah.
And I experienced that myself. I had a job interview actually after my bachelor that I didn't get my dream job to work for Bombardier Aerospace at the time. And the first interview was at Carleton. So they came to the campus. And then they invited people for a second interview in Toronto. And I didn't get invited to the second interview. And some of my friends did, who were way lower academic performance than me. Because, of course, at that time, it would violate GDPR. They literally post the list of all the students in our program and who was ranked highest in terms of grade.
Really?
You could always see that.
Wow.
So I was always either number one or number two. I kind of was going back and forth with one guy, and then he went sort of the aerodynamics route, and I went the structures route. So then we were the top of our specialization. So I was like, this doesn't make sense. Why are these students getting a second interview? It's not like I blew the interview looking back on it. So I decided to contact the recruiter and ask for feedback. And, is there anything they could give back to me? And they told me, like, you did exceptionally well in the interview. There was nothing wrong. You answered all the questions correctly. You gave all the right technical answers. And they basically said, we decided not to invite you for a second interview because your grades are too high.
That was the reason.
Yeah. And then they said, in our experience, those people who get such exceptional grades prioritize grades above all else. So they don't know how to work well in a team and accept other people's work. They think their work is better than everyone else's. They don't know when to switch off and relax and get involved in. And they listed all these things off. And honestly, I completely agreed with them because I looked at my bachelor and, I was that annoying person in a group who was redoing other people's work because it wasn't up to my standards.
Right.
I was skipping all the engineering parties to do extra homework, and that got me the higher grade, but it didn't necessarily meant I learned more.
Right.
And it meant I actually missed out on skills that are actually very important to being a functional engineer in a company.
Yeah. I suppose maybe on the flip side, and probably something that you understood as well as a student, is that yes, higher grades don't necessarily correlate to higher understanding and mastery of a subject, but they do tend to correlate to better outcomes or more prestigious outcomes, if you will. And so then, for a student trying to master a subject instead of trying to get the best grade, what's the metric by which you would suggest a student measures their mastery of a subject?
I always sort of say, go back to, like, if you're looking at a course, go back and look at the learning objectives.
Okay.
That's what we're trying to measure. And I'll be the first to admit that exams are an imperfect measure of mastery.
Okay.
Because you can have, what other situation in your engineering career are you going to be locked in a room for 3 hours with basically the pressure of someone pointing a gun to your head saying, do engineering? With no ability to check additional external resources, no ability to talk. Like that's not the real world. but it is a constraint. It's a boundary condition we have to work around. You know,
Yeah.
it's the same when we certify an aircraft, right? Like
Yeah.
how we test it is not, it's an imperfect representation
course.
of reality,
What's
but we have to
engineering?
do something.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, like, you know, to be honest, if I had my way, I would get rid of grades. I would make things pass fail,
Okay.
because grades get twisted as a metric, as an imperfect metric to differentiate people.
Mm-hmm.
And then it causes a change in behavior to game the system,
Okay.
right? Like to do the things that you know you need to do to get a better grade, not necessarily to learn.
Okay.
Maybe a classic example of this is you hear nowadays a lot of people get upset with AI,
Mm-hmm.
right? And some students may use AI, whether they're not supposed to or not, that's a different thing, but they may use it and it helps them get a better grade, where some other students will say, I actually don't want to use AI because I believe for myself, I would learn more by not using it.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard that too.
And there are situations where that may be true. You could argue there are situations where AI can help in the learning.
Yeah.
But if you see that you are making that choice for the benefit of your learning, but the people taking the shortcut are getting better grades, that disparity is hard to live with.
Hard to manage, yeah. And do you think, because you've also managed blended learning here at the university, do you think there could be something like a blended assessment where assessments aren't so, as you mentioned, 3 hours locked in a room, gun to your head, and a bit more real world? We give you certain access to different environments, resources, and we give you a task to complete. Do you think that's possible?
It is. The challenge in assessment is the scale.
Okay.
So let's compare at a master's level. Like with a master's course, tends to be a lot less students. It's a specialized course, and there's many other courses. So you may have a course of 30 students.
Mm-hmm.
You can do much more open-ended things. And I see a lot of my colleagues will do this. They'll have an assignment that students need to do, and they're given feedback on the assignment, but the assignment isn't graded.
Okay.
But then there's an oral exam, and what they produced for their assignment, their report, is the subject of half of their exam. They kind of open up that assignment and sort of say, okay, you've put this here. Can you defend that? Can you elaborate on that?
Right.
And that really helps to sort of separate the people who can hand in something that may be correct from those who understand that it's correct. And that's a bit of the problem, is assessment is about producing a product where the understanding is nuanced.
Okay.
And in a bachelor course, when you have like 500 students, it's hard to give a question that there's multiple answers if they're defended correctly. Assessing that becomes a massive challenge. So we end up contriving these problems where there is defined expected answers. So
Right.
it puts this false sense that my job is to get the right answer.
Right. It's to be able to understand when or how to get to the right answer. Right. And so we talked about blended. I mentioned it. Maybe we should go a bit more in depth. So explain to us, what is blended learning, why you started doing it.
Yeah. So what we mean by blended is that you're mixing sort of classical face-to-face classroom activities, whether it is a frontal lecture or small group instruction with online elements or text-based elements. So it can be using educational videos, it can be using readings and self-assessment quizzes. And what it's meant to do is twofold. It provides a little bit more engagement for the student with the material, because if you're in a classroom with 300 students and it's a classical frontal lecture, it's very difficult to engage. Like, most people are sitting there. Yes, the professor may ask some questions and a couple people will answer, but you're kind of like locked in a room. And I say locked in a room for a reason, because sometimes the lecture goes slow and it's boring, and you would, if you were at home watching that, you would walk away. But in a classroom, and the social pressure of all the students around, you don't do that. So it replaces that with, smaller chunks that you can give sort of a 5-minute part of a lesson. But now that they have that, you can give them the students some multiple choice questions to help them figure out, do they actually understand what they just watched?
Right.
And so you're trying to get them to engage with the material. So that ideally makes the learning more engaging, and it provides the content that the student needs to succeed, so that in the classroom you have the freedom to sort of ad lib, right? Like before I did blended learning, I literally went in the lecture room and it's like I have 2 45-minute slots to get through this massive PowerPoint slide deck.
Yeah.
And in a way, I had no time to entertain questions that disrupted my script.
Okay.
So now I can be like, I have all the resources online that they're supposed to prepare. So now let's interact, let's discuss, let's have a little bit more free-form interaction.
Right. Yeah, well, that's actually a fair point, because it's a critique I've heard a lot of students make, my peers, is that sometimes the professor will walk into class and he'll just read off the slides or read off his notes, and there's no real engagement. You're lulled to sleep in the back. Yeah. So I think it's a really good approach. How blended does it get? So when we're talking about blended learning, you use lightboards, you use pre-lecture videos. Have you ever, now with the burst in AI technology, have you considered using any form of AI with your teaching approach?
Yeah, I'm a little bit careful with the use of AI from a copyright standpoint.
Okay, fair enough.
Right.
Yeah.
So if I make a video and I post it on my YouTube channel, I try not to use AI generated content.
Right, but I mean, in the sense of, let's say a student has, I suppose maybe the analogy, and this isn't exactly the analogy, it's like an AI TA, where you would have, on Brightspace or whatever course page you use, you could have, hey, look, here's a discussion forum, here's our dedicated chatbot.
Yeah, indeed. I don't know if you're aware of the Just Ask Momo
initiative.
I've
heard of it.
So
exactly, yeah.
I actually, Momo was one of my TAs for statics, and I basically was one of the pilots in the early days of her thing. And I think it's a wonderful tool. And I actually use AI myself quite a bit to brainstorm and things. And I also plan on using it in educational activities. Actually, we're doing a curriculum redesign and a way to teach students about the importance of how a solution is written and communicated. One of the activities we're designing is to take previous exam questions and ask AI to provide a solution.
Okay.
And then give the solution to students and say, well, you need to verify this solution. Yeah. And check whether it's communicated effectively. Are all the things defined properly? And of course, we'll tweak the AI solutions a little bit, so sometimes they're wrong. But yes, sometimes we'll give it that it's correct. And we'll be transparent that it is an AI-generated solution. And I think this isn't necessarily in conflict with the learning objective.
Yeah, I agree.
Then you're teaching people to critically reflect on their solution rather than, can I get the right answer?
Exactly.
And it also kind of makes this, it addresses the reality, actually. We were talking to some people from Airbus, and they said, in this age of AI, of course, we're going to use AI to do calculations and do tools. And what we need an engineer to be able to do is to be able to verify.
Right.
And we can really shift that onus from producing something, so producing that report, producing that solution, to critically looking at it and understanding if it's correct.
Right.
And that's a huge shift. Like, I did an experiment once where I put on one of my exams in the second year. I wrote a solution where and I incorporated very common student mistakes in that solution. So the final answer, the units were wrong. The order of magnitude was several orders off. And the question was, can you review it? And it was only one page A4, so it wasn't huge. And, identify errors. And students were just like, this is crazy. You're not telling me how many errors there are. And because they wanted it to be a fixed task rather
Right.
than just look at it and
Yeah. It's a different
and
skill.
comment. Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed.
And so you've also worked blended learning. You've done the student flight data recorder project.
Yep.
Can you explain to me, to everyone watching, what that is in terms of how a student should approach learning?
Yeah, well, the student flight data recorder basically uses a symbol of this flight data recorder, and it was an epiphany that came partway through my teaching sort of career, where I did research on failure.
Okay.
That's literally where my research was: fatigue and damage tolerance, and essentially it was like, we need to understand every way something can fail so that we can make it succeed. And I kind of realized human learning is the same thing, right? You know, if you are put in a room and all you do is succeed, you're not learning anything, right? You're not expanding your capabilities. Like, if you're learning something, you have to be in a situation where you have some degree of struggle. That's where the learning happens. And this has been well known in the education world, and they sort of place this importance on self-reflection. And I've been to lots of education conferences, and all of these universities were developing these programs where students had to write self-reflections and submit them, and those were read by professors. And I had this epiphany. I'm like, I thought of myself, if I was a student and I knew a professor was going to read my self-reflection, I'm not giving an honest self-reflection.
Oh, me neither.
That's way too vulnerable.
Yeah.
I'm going to write what I think the professor wants to hear. And we saw this happening a lot. And it made me think of the flight data recorder in accident investigation, which is a very sensitive device. Like, literally, it's a device that records the sound in the cockpit during a flight of the pilots. They don't want everyone hearing that. So this is a protected device, right? Like, the company they work for, the airline, they're not allowed to look at that data.
Right.
It is protected that only air accident investigators can look at it. And that is a agreement between pilot unions and associations and the investigators, because they realize that that data is useful to investigate and understand failures, but it's sensitive. And so I tell students that, right? Like, I want you to reflect. And I created this journal with self-reflection exercises because when things go wrong, when you're struggling, or if you fail an exam, you need to reflect on, you know, what decisions did I make that contributed to that. I'm not saying that it would necessarily be all your fault. Like, when we use this thing called a Swiss cheese model, like, there's all these layers, and you know, the professor might have made the exam too hard, right? I always say that's one layer. I have some responsibility on that. I do check and make sure that oversight, and I make corrections if I really feel that for some reason there was something unfair about the exam. But it can't be the exact same difficulty level every time. So there's going to be some fluctuation. So you could say that's one layer. But there are other layers, and some of those are under your control. And rather than blaming the things that are out of your control, you have to look at the things that are under your control and make adjustments and changes there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's important to take responsibility if you want to grow, or else you'll just be blaming everyone else, never finding a reason to grow. And so, you know, blended learning, the data recorder project, they seem to be a wider effort to bring students towards a deeper understanding of what they're studying. Could you explain more to me what the kind of core motivation for you is in developing these projects?
I think the core motivation for me was, maybe it sounds a little bit sad, but I started teaching statics, which is in the first quarter of the first year. And later on, I got put on a course in the second year. And I saw this huge shift in the mindset of the students from the very beginning of their bachelor to the second year, but in a bad way. You know, in the first quarter of the first year, everyone's just so motivated to be here, and they have such big aspirations with what they're going to do with their career. They have such great habits. They really try to do everything. And then I saw this slow deterioration. I would talk to some of my colleagues teaching later in the first year, and we tried to align our courses, and we were always in opposition of, do we force them to complete these homework assignments, or do we give them to them but give them the responsibility to do it? And I could give them the freedom in the first quarter, and so many people would do it. But after 1 or 2 exam periods, failing an exam, facing this adversity, their mindsets were changing. And then by the time I get them in second year, my attendance in my lectures would drop to like, say, 25, 30%. People were just studying past exams, looking for patterns. They were trying to survive, which is okay. Like, I don't blame that, but not in a constructive way for their learning. So it made me think, well, what is missing? Like, how do we help these students grow and be aware of things earlier on?
Yeah. And speaking of first years, we've seen kind of over the past 10, since TU Delft has climbed the rankings quite significantly, there's been an explosion in international students. And you being an international yourself, do you feel a responsibility to kind of, you were teaching the English course, as you mentioned, to integrate them? And is there any special considerations you make, or a special vision you have for those who are coming here just for the quality of education?
To integrate them into Dutch society?
No, to integrate them into the aerospace industry, understanding that they're kind of coming from different parts. There's people from all over Europe, there's people from Asia coming here. Is there a sense of community that you want to build? Because, for example, your course statics, the one you manage right now, is quite famous for being very engaging, very well developed. Is there an ulterior motive in terms of, I want the students to feel like this is a university where they can kind of engage with the material and it's not a study place?
Yeah. I think it's less about engaging with the material, but more creating a sense of belonging. Sure. So the thing that you really notice when you talk to first-year students is there's a huge level of imposter syndrome, right? Like, although almost everyone that comes here was probably the top in their high school, they're coming to this, a world-famous program, and they see everyone around them. Maybe when you're surrounded by like 400 other students who are top in their class, you've never been in such an environment where everyone is good. You suddenly feel much lower than you ever have in your past. Then there's also the reality that you are going to struggle in things, and not everyone around you is going to have the same struggles as you. And we're in society has this problem of focusing on, if you're struggling with something, you can find examples where it seems that other people are not. And social media doesn't help with this, right? Everyone curates this vision of perfection and everything. And so I know people really struggle with that. So I try and create a environment where there's a bit of fun, because if you're having fun, it doesn't, even though you're struggling, if you can make a struggle fun, somehow it helps a bit. But also create an environment where it's okay to be authentic. So I really took into my first year lectures of, I am going to be me when I'm in my lecture, because I need to, by example, show students that it's okay to own who you are and your thoughts and how you. And it's quite funny because I co-teach, and I've had to have this discussion with any new teacher that kind of comes on. I'm like, don't come in and look at my lecture and think you have to be me. You will be horrible if you're pretending to be me. You have to be you. And that might be very different. And it's also nice to see teachers realize, to find that, because they also get that sort of imposter syndrome. If they come and they're co-teaching with me and they're like, yeah, but you were teacher of the year of the Netherlands and I've never taught a bachelor course. It's like, okay, like, look, you're going to go in, the first one is not going to go great, but it's fine. Like, we'll fix it and you'll develop. And that's also the nice thing about being blended. It's like, the resources are there. They can find their way. They're going to succeed.
That's true. And how do you decide what the next generation of aerospace students needs to learn? What's that process like in terms of the content?
That's always well, we're actually going through a curriculum redesign process within in the faculty, and that's a tough one because when people are most of the staff here are researchers, right? And when you're a researcher in an area, you tend to feel that your area is the most important area, right? That's why you went into that area. I think we have a teaching content problem. In the sense that we put so much focus on we need students to see this content. The reality is, in this day and age with the internet and resources, you can find content, right? So we need to teach students how to learn things themselves. Of course, there's always a certain level of fundamentals and an awareness, but I always sort of say, you know, like take a student at the end of the bachelor and sit them in a random first year test without giving them time to restudy it. They'll struggle. They will. Because what we ask for while you're taking the course is going to be higher than what we expect you to retain. And what I always sort of say, what I hope for is that, not that you'll be able to do it, but that you'll look at that question and be like, yeah, okay, I remember that this was an important theory, and then you can go look it up and kind of relearn it. And I think we need to realize that a little bit more and spend more time on sort of, I hate the term, but soft skills and communication and teamwork. You know, we put students in groups, but students hate working in groups. And that's a problem because you're never going to work independently as an engineer. Afterwards. So I think there's a lot more we could do there. But it's a scaling issue as well, right? When all the classes are 440 students.
Is that a big challenge for you guys, managing class size?
Yeah, so in the bachelor, we double teach. To be honest, I think in the first year, it would really help if we could get class sizes down even smaller than half the cohort at a time, because then you have more possibility to interact. We're lucky, we rely on teaching assistants and put in smaller groups, and we recruit very capable teaching assistants, and that helps. But the amount of contact that first year students have with professors is quite low because of the number of students that we have here. You know, it could be worse. Like, I know in some faculties, they go teach with 1,000 students at once in the aula. And
that's insane.
That's very, very different.
And speaking of this reorganization of the education, in the next 10, 15 years, to you, what would be the ideal scenario for one of the classes you teach? A student walks into the lecture hall. What is he seeing in terms of assessment, in terms of material, the engagement with the professor and the TAs? What's the ideal scenario for you?
For me, the ideal situation is we wouldn't necessarily have a classroom for lecturing. We would still have sort of a lecture hall for more informative things where professors could talk about their research and things that are going on from an interest sake. And that students would come that are interested. But instead, that the university program would be more built around a challenge base. So maybe you have a year-long project. And then you have all the resources in terms of video, blended interactive textbooks, so that you could learn the content to apply to that. And then there would be moments for professors to be able to interact and talk with students at different times. The challenge with this is that it requires then professors to be generalists. In the sense that you would have to be, which is a good thing, you'd have to be much more aware of everything that's being taught in the bachelor so that you could potentially advise and facilitate on different levels, rather than just being, you know, I'm the person who does dynamics and that's all I do.
And for those, kind of going off topic now, for those who are looking to take up teaching roles like yourself, maybe are starting out or they're in their bachelor still but have that ambition, what would you tell them it's important to consider? Again, pieces of advice or little nuances you didn't expect along the way.
Specifically for teaching in the university or teaching in general?
What do you think is more appropriate to give advice for?
Well, I would say if you want to teach within a university, you're going to have to, at this moment, and I hope it changes more in the future, you will have to prioritize research and having a strong research profile to get your foot in the door. Although there is a shift and a change in the appreciation for teaching, in terms of securing a position within a university, it is typically related to your research and your research potential. I think it's like anything, and this is not just for being a teacher, it's for anything, is you have to take opportunities that come and give them a chance.
Yeah.
I was actually having a discussion with some students who had an internship, and they really they didn't enjoy the internship for reasons I won't go into. And we were talking about that, and I sort of said, okay, yeah, you didn't enjoy that part of the internship. Did you learn anything? Like, did you gain anything? And I think if anyone tells you they know exactly what they want to do with their life, they're probably lying. To some extent, or they're creating a story that fits their current situation.
Okay.
But if they went before where they were now, they didn't necessarily know that they were going to be there. And actually, I watched some of your earlier podcasts, and you talk about the background, and almost everyone that you've interviewed on this has sort of this weird, like, I fell into this through a sequence of events.
Yeah.
So my advice is always like, if you're in a certain situation, give it a chance. I always sort of say, give it a timeline of, I'll stick to this. I commit to this for 1 to 2 years.
Okay.
Or whatever period of time. But I normally say at the beginning of your career, kind of think about that. And then kind of lay out for yourself, what can I learn or get out of this position over the next 1 to 2 years that will enrich me and maybe make me more marketable for other positions. It doesn't mean you're going to go for something else, but it gives you a goal for something to achieve for yourself rather than just doing a job. And then at the end of that period of time, you reassess, right? Like sometimes it's that shift of, focusing on the bad. It's the same when you're a student, right? You can come here and be like, the study load and all this, but then you're like, it's pretty concrete. Like if I can get to the end of the degree and have that degree, that will help me market myself.
Of course,
so that's a very concrete example, but every job will have the same sort of thing.
Yeah. You mentioned research. Talk to me a little bit about your own research, what it was like here at the TU, and then collaboration with students, for example, on that kind of tangent of students who want to do research. What you wished undergraduates, graduates would do more often in collaborating with professors and postdocs?
Yeah, so my research has been in the area of failure, fatigue and damage tolerance, and I've had a lot of fun. I think the nice thing about being in academia is that it might sound bad to put it this way, but it's not like anyone's immediately depending upon you getting a job done.
Sure.
And that sounds a little bit strange, but it gives you freedom to explore things and to go off on tangents. And that can be frustrating for students. I've had students come and do a master's research with me, and they've gone into the lab and they come back and they're like, the test didn't go as I expected. The data's all weird. And I get excited. Yeah. Right? It's like, oh, okay, it's not what we expected. So there's a puzzle here. Like, let's figure this out. And for the average student, they're like, yeah, but we were expecting this, and this was the path we were going to go down. And I think that's the benefit of academic research, is that you kind of go in one direction, but secretly you hope that you have to take a 90-degree turn because you hit something interesting. So that is an interesting aspect of research, and then the communicating that pathway through it.
So graduate students are kind of guaranteed research at some point. For undergrads, what type, maybe specifically here at the TU or in your experience, what would you advise in terms of getting involved in research? Because there doesn't seem to be as many open and structured opportunities.
Yeah, I, I would say at the undergrad level, and you shouldn't be too worried about research yet.
Okay.
Because the way I perceive things is that the bachelor is more about developing you into an engineer
Mm-hmm.
and an engineering mindset. So rather than looking at what research can I do, because it's the research process requires specialized knowledge, but there's this the whole scientific method approach towards it, and you're not really focusing on that in your bachelor. What I would sort of say, instead of narrowing down into one specific area which you do in research, pursue opportunities to do some sort of engineering where you're synthesizing the different topics and knowledge you're being exposed to in your bachelor.
Right.
And I think one of the greatest opportunities for that here in Delft is things like dream teams or the student teams. And actually, you asked about my ideal version of university. I actually think if you had things like the dream teams and sort of said, okay, everyone has to do a project and they have to design and build something, and then you just support them in that. I sometimes look at the dream teams and what some of those students do, and they learn way more than they learn
I agree.
in their entire bachelor degree.
Yeah.
You know, I was at an error accident investigation conference, and there was a group of students from Delft, from the DARE project, and they presented a paper at this conference because they had a failure of one of their rockets that they launched. And then they consulted myself and a co-teacher of a forensic engineering course at the time. They wanted to investigate this. And so we advised them, gave them some advice on how to do it, and they presented this to air accident investigators from around the world. And they were getting questions from the audience. They're like, so how long have you been studying accident investigation? They're like, we haven't studied it at all. Like, they've never done any formal, they said that they consulted us and that they did their own research based upon our advice and just went along and did it. And so many people in the audience were dumbfounded how these bachelor students with no formal training in accident investigation could do an investigation to such a level that it looked like a professional investigation. And it was because they were just doing something that they really wanted to do, not something that they had to do.
Yeah.
Right? They took something that was really an emotionally heartbreaking thing. Like, I actually have a video that they made where they did the launch, and literally you can see that it broke up, and they're sitting in the control room, and many of them are in tears.
So many hours just put into something.
You put so much into it, and then it just falls apart like that. And it's easy to just walk away from that and be like, okay, I failed. And no, they had this sort of mindset of, we need to understand why this happened so that we can prevent the next team from having to go through this heartbreak.
Yeah, exactly.
And creating situations like that where what you are doing has value beyond the course.
Yeah, gives you the real world reference and understanding.
Right?
Yeah.
Like all of, I actually do some advising in some educational settings. And there's this idea of, like, our assessments all go into the garbage, right? Like, you ask students to do an assignment, the professor reads it, and then it's filed away. Like, it has no impact on the world.
Yeah.
And that's a problem.
Yeah.
It's the same with writing. There's this famous professor from the University of Chicago who teaches academics how to write. And I actually give his lecture to all of my PhDs and master's students. And he's very confronting at the very beginning. And he's like, all of you graduate students, you think you know how to write. But you don't, because the only thing you have written in your entire career has been read by people who were paid to read it. And if they weren't being paid, they would not have continued to read past the second sentence.
Yeah,
and it's true.
a great point. Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Because we're all trained to write what we think is expected, not write something that has intrinsic value.
It incentivizes people to read it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, in wrapping it up now, is there any lingering pieces of advice, recommendations you would have for anyone watching, books you've read, experiences you've had? You mentioned student teams being one of them. Is there anything you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah. I think the big thing is just recognize that everyone around you is struggling and doesn't know what they're doing either.
Okay.
I think that's been one of the most enlightening things for me to recognize. That, and the thing that I sort of said earlier of, don't follow other people's expectations. We didn't really necessarily talk about that, but when I got the Teacher of the Year award, I actually went through, it was at a point where I had this existential crisis. Like, I was literally being told, you do a good job in teaching, but you need to do more on this research side and less in teaching for your career. And I really got stuck between this, like, well, do I do what people are saying, expecting so that I could rise up the ranks? And I kind of said, well, that doesn't make me happy. So I literally said, sod it. I'm not going to listen to my manager. I'm going to put lots of effort into my teaching. I started doing more blended. And I said, if they don't like it and they fire me, this isn't the place for me.
Right.
And I granted, I'm very lucky. It's not like I'm saying everyone does that, you're going to become National Teacher of the Year. But sometimes when you stop doing what other people expect and do what you really want to do, despite what other people expect, you can achieve great things. And that's a big piece of advice.
Beautiful message. Thank you so much, Dr. Rans. Thank you for sitting down with us.
Yeah.
Really appreciate your time. That'll be it from us, everybody. Thank you for watching.
Thanks.